Grüß, willkommen in meinen Aufregens video. Welcome to another exciting video, in this case episode 9 of my Wargaming Rules Review series of videos. In this video I'll provide an overview of Napoleon at War, a board game converted into a figure gaming format. This video is fundamentally a review of the SPI Napoleon at War board game. While this is a board game, I'll also cover how players convert this board game into a figure gaming format. As any player can download the SPI rules, maps and counters, no actual set of rules will be provided, as any player can perform their own conversion. In this review, I'll investigate converting a board game into a figure game, its advantages, its disadvantages, and why it was so rare, and why many modern rules represent a hybrid between these two ways of gaming. Let's quickly first define what I mean by a board game. I'm specifically talking about a historical board game using cardboard playing area with a hex grid laid across it and cardboard counters which represent the historical formations or units. The grid, in this case hex space, is designed to regulate movement and combat. Shown here is the SPI board game Marengo, the playing area, rules and counters. On the other hand, a figure game, as the name implies, uses metal or plastic figures based on cardboard or MDF bases instead of cardboard counters, and the playing area is designed to resemble the terrain it's supposed to represent. There's normally no grids, and terrain, with some minor concession, is supposed to look like diorama of the actual battlefield. There are of course hybrid games or game systems, in this case a big base set of rules which simply uses large counters, with board game-like values printed on them, but with figures placed on them to make them look pretty. The playing area, while still attempting to be diorama-like, has a much more regulated and board game terrain feel to it, but still there is no grids to regulate movement. Some pure board games also attempt to obtain the feel of figure gaming. In this case, the grids are large squares, which are visible but do not clutter the playing area. The counters, like the big battle rules, have board game-like values on them, but attempt to look like the troops they're representing. This is a board game, but attempts to look like a figure game and provide the benefits of a figure game format. The advantages of board gaming is, normally, it's easy to set up and quick to play. If we look at the SPI quad games, Napoleonic, specifically the Napoleonic's Battle series, the playing area is small, the number of counters are typically no more than 100 total, and the number of game turns range from 12 to 20. Players can set up a game in 10 minutes, complete a game within 2 to 3 hours, and pack up in 10 minutes, all on a dining room table. The disadvantages is its abstract nature. As you can see here, the counters do not look like the troops they represent, and the playing area does not really look like the terrain the battle was fought over. Modern board games do a better job at giving players more of the feel, but it's still basically an abstract experience, with the main focus to understand what's happening in the historical battle and have a nice, short, competitive game with a clear winner and loser. The advantages of figure gaming is, if you expend the effort, you get the feel of what it was like to be on the battlefield. Figure gaming is, for the most part, all about the feel. Beautiful figures, beautiful playing areas, and with the actual game coming typically second. For some people, the game itself is almost irrelevant, and a few games ever end. For other players, a good game is still important, but the primary driver is still getting the bling. The disadvantage of figure games is it takes a long time to set up and pack up, and unless some real thought has gone into the actual scenario, the game can take too long to complete. While setting up nice figures in a playing area a few times without getting a good game can be, possibly acceptable for a while, eventually most gamers simply get bored. You do, in the end, need a game. One solution to the never-ending figure game is to reduce the number of figures and play possibly a skirmish game. This works well with 25mm or larger figures, can involve a large playing area with large terrain and diorama features on it, and with 25 to 50 figures per side, they can use a very simple set of rules. Another solution is to use big base sets of rules, where each counter may represent a lot of figures, but is still basically a single counter, of which each player may possess 12. Also counters only. Another solution is to use a traditional figure gaming set of rules where you only have figures on the playing area, but it's restricted to a small force mix. DBN is a classic example, and a standard game requiring 12 elements per side on a 2-foot square playing area does achieve all the benefits of a board game, while still retaining many of the advantages of figure gaming. Another solution is to use figures instead of cardboard counters in a traditional board game. In this case, figures are being used for a game of Lost Battles. Using the Lost Battles board game for a figure game is possibly the only real successful example of this I'm aware of, mainly because the issue of the grid is minimized. Lost Battles uses a very simple 20 square grid, which if large enough doesn't really look bad at all. Unfortunately, most board games use a hex grid, and there are normally a lot of hexes. This example attempts to minimize the biggest issue with the hex, the lines. This looks nice, but for a pure figure gamer who wants the playing area to look as real as possible, the hexes detract from the experience. There are other issues with hexes. The GHQ hex system, which can give you some very nice terrain, is really designed for very small playing areas. It can take hours to set up a 4x3 foot playing area, much less something larger. However, saying that, this is a viable strategy and gamers can end their search here. Find a board game they like, build up the necessary hex-based playing area and use existing figures and go for it. However, I've tried this in the past and have generally considered it as not that successful. You could go down the path of using larger hexes or using a square grid with the centre of the square marked on the playing area with some form of mark. All these are also viable, but my holy grail is to avoid the use of any form of grids on the playing area. 1 foot squares may be barely acceptable, but even there I prefer a large continuous playing area surface. In conclusion, any board game you select will require a player to convert the regulated hex-based movement system into a non-grid movement system. The other aspect to consider is the complexity of the board game you'll convert. A set of rules, such as Ney versus Wellington, could be considered an ideal board game to convert. Every strength point represents 100 men, and the accuracy and detail is impressive. The only issue is that these are not simple rules, being one of the monster game systems which SPI came out with in the late 1970s. As a result, only small battles could be simulated easily, such as this one. The other issue is the game system is also complex, requiring a lot of minor player actions such as skirmish fire, all very historical, but a lot of benefits of using a board game are being eroded, so why bother? My earliest attempt at converting a board game into figure gaming was using this game system, and while I retained the use of the hex grid because of the effort involved in making major changes to the rules, which at that time was something I was not interested in the end there was no benefit with a traditional figure game set of rules. I ended up with a large and complex game which took a long time to set up, play and pack up. In the end I abandoned the project and went back to a pure figure gaming set of rules. Interestingly, many years later I found this image on the internet, which I think is someone's attempt to do the same thing, but this is clearly not using hex grids. While it's possible this is from another set of rules, the use of strength point markers make me think this is Ney versus Wellington board game using figures. Someone clearly succeeded where I failed, but the other issue is the use of counters and markers. I'd prefer to just use the figures or elements as strength points, thus avoiding the use of any counters on the playing area. I'm also assuming that here the scale has been dramatically changed in order to make the game more manageable, which is a good option as well. After much thought and many years, I decided that in order to have a chance of success, you need to select a very simple board game and game system, which in my case was the SPI board game Marengo. I must have played this game at least 24 times, as it was a popular choice in board gaming competitions that I was involved in, and I do have pleasant memories of the game. There were some historical issues with the game system, such as both sides needing to have a front line from map edge to map edge, but this could be quickly resolved with some simple command control rules and changes to the way zones of control worked. In terms of counters, each side commanded 28 to 25 counters each, with each strength point representing about 500 men in this case. You would need to add a CNC elements and some core commander elements to give you your command control, but these elements would not add any complexity to play. Players would have a choice how they wish to deal with the counters, either a single element or multi-element unit per counter, with its value being indicated by a counter, or a big base with elements on it, each element representing a strength point. My preference is to avoid any counters on the playing area, so I'd go with the latter, but the former does give you a smaller playing area. If we go with option 1, we're assuming all units are 2 elements wide. As you can see here, I've selected the largest units from Marengo and shown how they may look when depicted as element. In my suggested game, I allow for strength point losses, which is not in the original rules. I've done this for game system reasons. The original game depended on surrounding counters with zones of control and forcing them to retreat in order to eliminate them. I needed to change this to avoid the front line across the playing area effect of this type of game system. In my suggested system, each strength point loss would result in one element being removed. If there was one element, then I would adopt a one element wide formation. Just as an interesting point, when I initially created this video, it was many years ago, and this was my thought processes. I've since completely changed my mind, but nonetheless, I'll present it in this video because other players may find this particular approach more attractive than what I ended up with. Option 2 uses the same system, except each 2 strength point is an element and all elements are 1 element wide. This reduces the playing area size dramatically and is probably the optimal system. Fractions are rounded or added together to form full elements. Player's choice. The last option is to use counters to represent the strength of the unit, as seen here. This is an option, but one which I decided to initially not go down. However, other players may prefer this, and there's no reason why the modifications I would suggest would not work with these counters. As it turned out, this is what I ended up doing. I ended up creating individual elements, and basically I remembered their strength point value. I placed it on a cheat sheet and made sure it was all the same. So all musketeers had a strength of, let's say, 4 for standard morale, and 6 for veteran, and 8 for guards, etc. Scale and movement rates would be determined by the width of the unit. If using a 2-element width, then each hex would have a width of 8 cm if each individual element was 4 cm wide. If using a 1-element wide unit, then it would be 4 cm. In this case, the playing area is 24 hexes wide, which means the playing area would be about 192 cm wide if using 8 cm wide elements, and 96 centimeters wide if using 4 centimeter wide elements. In terms of depth, the playing area is 39 hexes deep, which gives you an area of about 312 centimeters or 156 centimeters, depending on whether or not using 8 centimeter wide elements or 4 centimeter wide elements. I must admit you do not need the entire playing area, but converting into imperial feet and rounding down, this is either a playing area of 6 by 10 feet or 3 by 5 feet. The first is simply too large and is not practical. If players wish to duplicate the whole playing area, they need to adopt the single element wide unit. However, if only playing the first half of the battle, as shown here, you could possibly use the 2-element wide units. While I like big playing areas, I have to err on the smaller side, and 1-element wide units is what I will absolutely adopt. A quick note about scale. In the larger Battle of Nations game of the same series, the game scale is much larger, and even at this scale the whole playing area is used. Thus, while Marengo can be played with 2-element wide units, most of the other battles in the SPI Napoleon at War quad cannot. This also shows the advantage of using a board game. The scale is automatically changed to fit whatever playing area you possess, allowing you to fight monster battles like Leipzig on the same playing area as Marengo. My final playing area is normally 3 by 6 feet, simply because the playing area I possess is generally this size. Actually, I did reduce this to 3 by 4 feet. This would show the Austrian force mix rounded down to 2 strength points per element. It rounds down very nicely, although I had to reduce the number of units by 1. Players could choose to reduce the size of one of the cavalry units by 1 to give you the correct number of units. You'll notice that one infantry unit has a movement 5 rather than 3. In this case, I'll use light infantry figures for that particular unit. The cavalry has 2 movement rates, 5 and 7. The cavalry unit has a movement of 5, is represented by heavy and medium, and the faster cavalry by light cavalry. We now have a force mix which does not need any markers, counters or record keeping, at least so far. Here we have the French. For the faster French, I use the French light infantry, and for standard, I use the French line infantry figures. For cavalry, I use hussars for the fastest cavalry and chasseurs for the slower cavalry. Well, I also mix dragoons in with that as well. Finally, the faster artillery is horse-drawn and the slower is foot. Players can use whatever troop types they wish based on the figures that they have, as long as it's clear that you know which unit is what. The way I divided up the troop types is, my preference. Other players may divide them up in any other way they wish. The important point to note is the figure type determines the movement allowance of the element, nothing more. This is a conversion of half the map into a playing area. The width is 3 feet. This would require reasonably flexible terrain pieces. The built-up areas are easy, as all my built-up areas are based on 3 cm or 4 cm square bits of MDF. The rivers may need some custom effort, or perhaps they could be simplified. The brown is rough or broken terrain, and I would scatter some gentle hills around as required to represent them. According to the initial deployment in the SPI board game Marengo, the initial forces would look as follows. The French have 8 more units off the top of the screen and 12 more units arriving as reinforcements between game turn 2 and game turn 9. Now let's look at the actual game system that I'm using, the SPI Napoleon at War game system. The sequence of play is about as simple as you could get. The Austrian's the first player and the length of the game is 14 game turns, which I imagine is about 1 hour each. Movement rates are determined by the element width. If using 4 cm wide elements, then the movement rates per game turn is shown here. Elements can freely move through friendly units, but may not do so through enemy units and must stop when they enter an enemy's unit's zone of control. No element can end its move on top of a friendly element. The rules are fairly basic. Because we are not using hexes, we need some simple movement rules such as MP costs in terms of element widths to turn to the flank, turn to the rear and so on. I've listed some of the rules which could be considered along with the existing movement costs converted into something which can be used without the use of hexes. The original rules use locked zones control, which in principle makes life simple but makes it hard to pull back as the French historically did, as well as being difficult to simulate when you don't have hexes. We will implement locked zones of control and allow withdrawal as part of combat, but locked zones of control stop all movement except to close into combat, which will be mandatory. Marengo does not have any roads and instead has trails, which simply negate existing terrain when you move along the trail. The same applies with bridges. Crossing a stream, which should be no more than 2 cm wide, costs 2 MPs. This means reducing the unit's movement allowance by 2 MPs and simply move across the stream. If an element remains on a stream, this can be ignored, only count the first element for crossing the stream. As for difficult terrain, players may choose whatever system they wish. My preference is a pro rata system, with each 1 cm crossed costing 2 cm when you're going through rough. There are steep slopes in the rules. Cross those at treat them as streams, except the cost to cross is 1 MP. I'm not trying to actually create a full set of rules. Players can do that for themselves and use some basic common sense. This is dependent on player preference, but I prefer having a zone of control half an element width from any point of an element. Once you move into an enemy zone of control, your movement stops. Some minor facing adjustments can be conducted to line up elements, but nothing greater than 22 degrees. For combat purposes, a zone of control would be 1 full element distance. Thus, there are 2 types of zones of control, one for movement, one for combat. A game designer would now need to possibly create a whole list of rules describing what can be done or not in different situations. I'll not do that here, and once again, players may need to use house rules or common sense to deal with this. This is a bit tricky, that is combat. How do you reproduce the hex-based combat system with something that works without hexes? The first critical rule is combat is compulsory, which means all enemy elements within a zone of control, which for combat in this case is 1 element wide, must be attacked. Units cannot split their attack, and if more than one target, they attack all targets as if it was a single unit. In summary, all elements must attack, and all enemy elements within a combat zone of control must be attacked. Let's look at this example. The left Austrian unit must ensure both units in its combat zone of control is attacked. The Austrians will attack the French unit on the right with the centre 2 units. So only the unit on the left must be attacked by this unit. It has 2 strength points against 2 strength points, so the attack is 1-to-1. We'll discuss the actual CRT later. The right Austrian unit must ensure both units in its combat zone of control is attacked. The Austrians will attack both French units. It has 2 strength points against 4 strength points, so the attack is 1-to-2. Not so good. The 2 Austrian units in the centre attack the single French unit. It has a strength of 6 SP against 2 SP, so it attacks at odds of 3-to-1. Rather good. All elements are attacking and all enemy units are being attacked. There is one modification to the original rules I would implement, which is a type of stacking. In the original rules, the S7 SP units were very effective and the smaller SP units could never combine their strength together because there was no stacking. This was, I think, a game flaw, and resolving it can be done with a simple stacking rule, which which is up to 3 elements can attack out of any element's frontage, with other elements in the rear contributing to the attack or defence. In this example, the French 2-element unit has a 1-element unit to its rear. Players may decide this should be in base-to-base contact or within 1 centimetre. I prefer base-to-base contact for simplicity. If the total number of elements is greater than 3, only 3 are counted, but all elements in both units are affected by any combat results. Mixing unit types are permitted. Basically, the strength points can combine into any particular type of unit structure you so desire to get your combat. And you can decide what the maximum stacking or the maximum number of elements can support the element to the front. Any artillery can attack any enemy element within 2 elements widths away, or 8 centimetres if using 4 centimetre wide elements. The artillery must not be in a ZOC, enemy ZOC, and can fire over friendly elements. Let's now look at the CRT. The only aspect I would add is casualties as well as retreat results. In this system, we do not normally eliminate enemy elements by surrounding them, so some other method is required to inflict casualties. A DR could be D1 or D2, with the numeric representing elements eliminated, and some attacking losses could also be expected. On the other hand, players could just leave the CRT as it is. Let's now conduct our attack. On the left we have a 1-to-1, the Austrian spin a 3. The French must withdraw 1 element, width, back, directly away from its attacker or attackers. The attacker can advance after combat, occupying the original position of the defender and moving no further than 1 element width. Only 1 unit may do so. The Austrians will now conduct the attack on the right, which is a 1-to-2 attack, and the Austrian spin a 3, which means the attacker must retreat back 1 element width back. The French player can advance after combat with 1 unit, but chooses not to do so. Now for the final combat. The Austrians attack at 3-to-1 and spin a 2. The defenders retreat and suffers 1 element loss. The Austrians advance after combat with 1 unit. This is the result of the Austrian combat phase. The only thing I don't like about this is the difficulty of withdrawing from combat, which is what the French did historically at Marengo. I'm uncertain how this could be simulated, and one of the issues of the Marengo game was how the French counterattack did not occur in a historical manner. For all extents and purposes, there is no flank or rear modifiers. This is reflected by the inability to retreat through an enemy movement zone of control. In this case, if the French were forced to retreat, they would be eliminated, as they cannot retreat through an enemy movement zone of control and must retreat directly away from its attacker. When hit on the flank, the retreat will occur directly away from the attacker, with some leeway if some other elements or units are in the way, or the friendly units behind must also retreat to clear a spot for the retreating element. This is not as brutal as the original game, which I feel is a good thing, as there was too much focus on moving to cut off the enemy rather than the actual combat itself. One of the issues with the original game was the focus on unhistorical outflanking moves, which did not occur generally. Outflanking was only an issue if there was a sufficiently large force available on one side, and it was able to, as did occur on the French right flank, but a single cavalry unit was not going to make that much of a difference. Thus, our flanking should only be possible with a reasonably large force mix with a high level commander. To encourage this, we could have commanders, with there being at least a CNC and flank commanders. The French were better serviced here, so should have 3 sub-commanders, with the Austrians too. Command radius would be 16 centimetres for a CNC and 12 for a sub-commander. Command control is traced from any point on the general to any point on the subject units. When out of command control, movement is halved and no element can move within an enemy movement zone of control. Sub-commanders are also affected, but their subordinate units are not if within the sub-commander's command control. Commanders have a movement of 6 MPs and a combat strength of 0. If attacked, they automatically suffer a DE. This shows a possible game turn 1 endpoint. The Austrians are desperately trying to get into attack position while the French are forming their defence, which would be behind the stream. For those interested, the SPI game can be downloaded from the internet very easily and at no cost. The link will be in the description. I did create a direct copy of Napoleon at War board game into a figure gaming format. However, most players can simply download the SPI board gaming rules, counters and pieces, and create their own figure gaming format. One benefit of using the SPI board game is there is a large number of scenarios available for players to try. Napoleon at Waterloo, which was first published in 1971, was the first of the Napoleonic battles using this system. This is the only game I've not converted into a figure gaming scenario, mainly because SPI came out with another game covering Waterloo, which was what I generally preferred. Borodino was published the following year in 1972. In 1973, the third game was published, Austerlitz. Because SPA came out with another game covering this battle later, I did not convert this into a figure gaming format. In 1975, SPI published its Napoleon at War Quad, which covers the battles of Marengo, Jena Austerlitz, Wagram and Leipzig. In the following year, 1976, SPI published its Napoleon Last Battles Quad. This covered the battles of Ligny, Quatre Bras, Wavre and Waterloo. In this case, all four maps could be joined together into a single monster map. In 1979, SPI published its Napoleon Art of War pair of games, Eylau and Dresden. Finally, in 1980, they published their last game, the Battle of Austerlitz, totaling 14 board games. The basic game system remained the same, but a lot of development occurred in terms of adding more accuracy and detail during this period of time, which spanned about just short of 10 years. Players could use the original SPI board gaming maps to create their own figure gaming playing area. On the left is the SPI map of Marengo, and the right is the playing area design for Marengo if you wanted to do a figure gaming format of it. This shows the same for Leipzig, and I must admit I've done Leipzig twice, one in a 4x3 foot format, which was simply too small, and I did another one which is double the size, which makes it a bit more reasonable, although the game just takes too long to play. But nonetheless, I like the Battle of Leipzig, and trying to reproduce it is always my great Napoleonic holy grail. When you drill down into the playing area, the SPI map can also provide a guideline for terrain setup as well. The rough terrain would be represented by hills, the woods by woods, swamps with swamps, and of course water features with water features. These are rather old rules and as such not commercially available. Some information about the rules can be found in the shown IO group site, and it's possible to download the full rules from the internet link shown below. Second-hand copies of the board game may also be available to purchase. And so this concludes episode 9 of my video series on rules reviews, in this case using or looking at the SPI Napoleon at War game system and converting it from a board game into a figure gaming format. Alle guten Dinge, kommen zu einem Ende.